In that quiet night, when Nathaniel Callahan chose the person who would accompany him to his younger brother's wedding, he did not choose a model, nor a successful businesswoman, nor the daughter of a senator, but walked straight into the kitchen of the mansion and pointed at the housemaid. Emily Carter froze, her hand suspended in midair with a glass still between her fingers, unsure whether she had heard correctly, while every cell in her body seemed to turn rigid. In the suffocating stillness, she could hear the second hand gliding across the clock on the wall. She was under no illusion about the man standing before her. Nathaniel never joked, and he was not the kind of man who repeated himself. It was close to midnight, the kitchen empty, most of the staff already gone for the night, leaving her alone washing the last few glasses after the Callahan family's dinner gathering. She often chose the late shift to avoid the eyes of others, and she liked the silence after 10 o'clock. Emily did not belong to this world, a stately mansion on the outskirts of Chicago where men wore suits even when there were no guests and women never walked in flat shoes. She lived like a shadow, quiet, restrained, existing silently among powerful and cold people. But tonight, the darkness was not enough to hide her. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his black shirt still buttoned, his sleeves rolled to reveal his wrist and a simple silver watch that could have paid her rent for an entire year. His hair was slightly tousled, his jaw tight, and his gaze sharp as though cutting straight through her. "Sir?" Emily stammered, her voice refusing to obey. Nathaniel stepped further into the kitchen, slow, deliberate, never looking away from her, as though sealing a decision that could not be undone. "You," he repeated with a low, unwavering tone. "You will go with me to Mark's wedding." The glass nearly slipped from her hand. She was wearing an old service uniform, her hair tied back with an elastic band, her canvas shoes worn at the heel. She had nothing that could draw the attention of a man like Nathaniel Callahan, much less make him choose her for such a formal event. "I think you are mistaken. I am just the housemaid." A cough sounded behind Nathaniel. Ethan Moore, his right hand and personal driver, leaned against a cabinet, his eyes filled with surprise and a hint of amusement. Nathaniel did not bother turning around. "I am not mistaken," Emily swallowed, confusion and panic tightening inside her. "Why me?" He looked at her with no hesitation and no romance. "Because every woman who wants to appear by my side has an agenda. They want money, status, power, or the Callahan name." She blinked. "And I have nothing." "Exactly," he said, his voice softening. "You are the only one in this house who dares to look at me without trying to be anything." Emily felt her heart skip, as though she had stepped off a ledge. She had never imagined that Nathaniel could see that. He always walked as though the world should part around him, cold, silent, untouchable. Before she could grasp the meaning of what was unfolding, a woman's voice rose behind her. "Nate, have you chosen who will accompany you?" Rebecca Callahan, the family's ceremony coordinator, stepped in with a tray of tea. When her eyes landed on Emily, she froze, her expression widening. "Good heavens, her?" "Yes," Nathaniel replied without the slightest discomfort. "Emily will go with me." Rebecca nearly dropped the tray. "Impossible." "Nate, this is an event for Chicago's elite press, politicians, top business figures. She is a serving employee. And the people attending," he cut in, "are still just human beings." Emily wished she could vanish. Ethan cleared his throat lightly, but his eyes gleamed as though watching a premium television drama unfold live. Rebecca turned to Ethan for help, but he only lifted a shoulder. "I have decided," Nathaniel declared. "She will go with me." No one spoke after that. Rebecca left, clearly displeased. Emily stood motionless, unsure whether this was a nightmare or a cruel joke. "Sir, I do not own a dress. I do not know how to behave. Everything will be prepared," he said. "You will not attend as a housemaid. You will attend as the woman I chose." Ethan nodded once. "Tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the morning, the car will pick you up." Nathaniel gave Emily one last look before stepping out. "When you walk into that wedding beside me, everyone will know you stand on my side. And tomorrow night, no one will dare lay a hand on you." The door closed behind him. Emily sank into a small kitchen chair, her hands still trembling. She had no idea what had just happened. But one thing was certain: tomorrow her life would cross into a world she had never dared imagine she belonged to. If you are still here listening and still staying with Emily, thank you truly. Not everyone has the patience to walk beside a quiet girl stepping into a world she never believed she could enter. If this story is touching you in some way, please subscribe, like the video, and share it so your loved ones can also hear tender fragments like this each day. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment below and let us know, so Emily and storytellers like us understand that whether you are in New York, Houston, or a small town along the Ohio River, this story has reached you. And perhaps, you are the one who will understand her more deeply than anyone else. Emily sat motionless in the empty kitchen, the warm yellow light casting over her pale skin, and Nathaniel's words still echoed in her mind, as though her thoughts could not keep up with the speed of what had just unfolded. When you walk into the wedding with me, everyone will know you stand on my side. She lowered her gaze to her hands accustomed to dish soap, scrubbing brushes, and tiny scratches, and wondered how they could ever belong to that world, the world of men in bespoke suits, of wine worth thousands of dollars, of camera flashes and powerful handshakes. No, it was impossible. Not for her. Not for Emily Carter, the woman who had tried to erase herself for 2 silent years, the woman who once fled a distant city with nothing but a single backpack and a fear so deep it had no name. She had believed that if she stayed quiet enough, faint enough, her past would not find her. But tonight, with a single sentence, Nathaniel Callahan had torn through that fragile disguise. She could not sleep. All night she stared at the ceiling, her fingers still remembering the cold of the glass when he had spoken her name. Part of her wanted to believe he had said it for some reason she had yet to understand, a strategy, a test, or even a moment of impulse. But his eyes had not lied. That gaze had not been the gaze of a man looking at an object. It had been the gaze of a powerful man choosing what would stand beside him in battle, simple, practical, and irrevocable. At dawn, before sunlight reached the cold stone hallway, Emily rose but did not go to work. She did not know what to do with herself. Her freshly laundered uniform lay on the bed as though waiting for her to step back into her old role. But that role had been stripped away, or rather, transformed, by the very man she did not dare to name too long in her thoughts. At 6:30, a knock came at the door. She opened it, still in her simple sleepwear, her hair tied high in dark circles beneath her eyes after a sleepless night. Standing before her was a stylishly dressed, middle-aged woman with blonde hair who smiled as though she had known Emily for years. "Good morning. I am Elena. Mr. Callahan called me at midnight. I have the entire day to prepare you." Emily could not find a response. "I think there has been a mistake." Elena stepped inside gently, her eyes holding no judgment, only the quiet certainty of someone who had helped hundreds of women walk confidently into worlds they believed they did not belong to. "There is no mistake." Mr. Callahan spoke clearly. "I do not need her to look like anyone else. I need her to be seen more clearly than ever, and you are that woman." Emily's fingers tightened around the hem of her nightdress, every muscle pulled taut. She did not want to stand out. She did not want to be seen. Every time she was seen, something terrible happened. Elena touched her arm lightly. "You are afraid," she whispered. "I can see that. But perhaps for the first time in a very long while, someone is standing on your side." Emily looked up, and for a fleeting second, she thought of Nathaniel's eyes. Not gentle, not inviting, just the gaze of a man accustomed to making decisions and refusing to be refused. "I have nothing to wear," she said, her voice barely more than breath. Elena smiled softly. "That is the part I will handle. All you must do is believe that you are worthy of whatever waits beyond that door." But how could she believe it, when her past was a long fracture filled with darkness? When every step outside her safety felt like the edge of a cliff, when the man who had pulled her out of invisibility was the very man all of Chicago knew not to go near? Emily did not belong where he stood. She knew that as surely as she knew her own breath. But when Elena opened a large case revealing elegant dresses and gold-lit jewelry, Emily could not stop the shiver that passed through her. Nor could she stop her eyes from drifting toward the red dress that hung in the place of honor. Not a loud, arrogant red, but a deep shade like aged wine, like blood, like a declaration that could not be undone. Elena followed her gaze and smiled. He chose that color. And he said, "Tonight, I want them all to see her." Emily felt something tighten inside her chest. Not fear, not quite hope, but the sensation of being pulled into a world where she no longer had the right to turn back. She did not know who she would become once she wore that dress. But she knew one thing with striking clarity. From the moment Nathaniel Callahan pointed at her in that kitchen, Her life no longer had a path back. The red dress hung with solemn prominence at the head of the bed like a declaration that could not be ignored, and Emily looked at it as though she were facing a living presence, a challenge she had never been prepared for. Elena did not rush her, only quietly opened the boxes of accessories, each silver comb, each pair of beige heels, each shimmering earring laid out as though preparing for a ritual rather than a celebration. Emily sat before the mirror, afraid to look at herself, her light brown hair released and falling over her shoulders, while Elena guided the comb through each strand with hands so gentle it felt as though she feared breaking something fragile inside her. "You have beautiful hair," Elena murmured, her voice like a lullaby. "You have only never allowed anyone to see it." Emily gave a faint smile, one that never reached her eyes. She had never let anyone touch her hair before, always tying it, brushing it herself, living in a quietness that asked for nothing, and now even that was being rewritten. When Elena began to apply makeup, Emily closed her eyes, not wanting to see each layer that softened her bare skin, not wanting to witness herself disappearing beneath each brushstroke. But when Elena's fingers touched her cheek, and she whispered, "Open your eyes," Emily obeyed. In the mirror was a woman she did not recognize, her eyes still the familiar, warm brown, yet lined softly, deeper, brighter, her cheeks carrying a gentle flush, and her lips red like a silent invitation. Nothing extravagant, yet everything impossible to hide. A woman who was being seen. Emily gripped the edge of her robe as Elena stepped back and reached for the red dress. "Are you ready?" Emily shook her head, but she did not say no. The woman helped her into the gown, each layer of smooth fabric gliding over her skin like water, fitting her perfectly, modest enough yet bold enough. Delicate straps resting at her shoulders, the open back revealing shoulder blades that were slender but unyielding, the small waist shaped by the elegant cut, the skirt flaring softly at the hips and falling to the floor, and Emily stared at her reflection, unable to breathe, seeing herself and yet a version she had never believed could exist. Elena stepped forward, fastening the gold-lit earrings onto her ears, then whispered, "They will never forget tonight." Emily did not reply, uncertain whether she wanted them to remember, but with each passing second, she knew that retreat was no longer an option. At exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, a knock sounded at the door, and Elena opened it to reveal Ethan, whose gaze landed on Emily, and in that moment, he, a man who had seen every kind of woman beside his employer, fell silent in astonishment. "Good heavens," he breathed. "She..." Elena smiled and gently guided Emily forward. "She is herself," she said. "Only, no one has ever seen her." Emily stepped from the room, each movement like treading upon a thin line between instinctive flight and the undeniable truth that tonight she was the one accompanying Nathaniel Callahan. As she descended the grand staircase of the mansion, the crystal chandelier casting light upon each step, every pair of eyes turned toward her. The staff, technicians, the assistants, the drivers, those who had only ever known her as a shadow in the kitchen, now frozen as though they had forgotten how to blink. Rebecca Callahan stood at the base of the stairs, phone in hand, lifting her head just as Emily reached the final step, and her expression hardened like a winter lake. "This is..." she began, but did not finish, because at that very moment Nathaniel appeared. He wore a black suit and a charcoal gray tie, his eyes never leaving Emily, not for a heartbeat, offering no compliment, no approving nod, but when he extended his hand, and she placed hers into it, his grip tightened around hers, steady, unyielding, a proclamation to the world. "Let us go," he said, and she nodded without speaking, his hand the same hand that had commanded a silent empire now leading her to the car, leading her to the place where every gaze would fall upon them. And Emily Carter, who had once been nothing more than a shadow behind the kitchen doors, was preparing to step into a night no one had ever imagined she would inhabit, in red, in sight, inside a story she herself could hardly believe was real. The car stopped before the grand entrance of the Grand Halston Hotel, where the lavish wedding of Mark Callahan, Nathaniel's only brother, was being held, the massive crystal lights casting brilliance across the marble steps, and the white columns adorned with flowers in deep silver and blue. The air filled with the scent of expensive perfume, wine, and power. Emily sat inside the car with her palms damp with sweat, and her heart pounding so rapidly she feared the man beside her might hear it. And Nathaniel stepped out first, offering his hand without a word, his gaze anchoring her to reality, as she placed her hand into his and stepped out of the car, the unfamiliar height of her heels altering her stride, yet she refused to falter, because every gaze that turned toward her carried curiosity, surprise, or thinly veiled disbelief. And then the whispers began to spread like ink on paper. Who is she? She looks familiar. Isn't she the Callahan housemaid? Impossible. Would Nathaniel bring her here? And each fragment cut through her like shards of broken glass, slicing into the thin shell she fought to hold together. But Nathaniel's hand remained firmly around hers, steady and unyielding, offering no explanation, no introduction, simply guiding her across the main hall, where the most powerful people in Chicago paused mid-conversation, mid-breath, mid-sip, and when they crossed through the glass doors into the reception, the stage lights shifted and struck the deep red of her dress, as though emphasizing a presence she never wished to claim. And Emily felt as though the entire room had stopped breathing for a heartbeat, the whispers replaced by wide eyes, shock, even irritation. Some men rising slightly as though drawn to what they could not interpret, women tightening their grip around their glasses as their eyes swept her from head to toe, and Rebecca Callahan, speaking with a circle of political figures, looked up just as they entered, her face turning pale as winter frost, and Emily avoided looking at anyone directly, keeping her eyes fixed on a soft reflection of light upon the marble floor, though she knew she was being looked at, not merely looked at, but examined, dissected, judged, as though the room were trying to tear her apart to find the reason why Nathaniel Callahan chose her, why out of all women she, the one who once carried trays behind them, now walked beside their host on the most important night of the year. When they reached the honor table, Ethan was already waiting and pulled out her chair, telling her softly that she had made the entire room forget how to breathe, and she replied with lips trembling that she was unsure whether that was a good thing, and Nathaniel glanced at her, the lightest touch of his fingertip against her hand, calming her more than any spoken reassurance, as he asked if she was all right, and she gave the smallest nod, one only someone truly attentive would notice, because she was not all right, but she would not allow it to show. Above them, the music swelled, and the host invited guests to raise their glasses, the wedding beginning exactly on schedule, and the attention gradually shifting to the bride and groom. Yet Emily knew with absolute certainty that tonight people would not only speak of vows and menus and rings and speeches, they would speak of her, the woman who entered the Callahan wedding draped in deep red without a title, without lineage, held only by the gaze of Nathaniel Callahan and a wordless declaration. And though every whisper threatened to shake her, and every stare made her feel as though she stood beneath a spotlight without a script, there remained one truth that kept her spine straight and her steps grounded. She had not chosen this, but she would not run from it. For the moment Nathaniel walked into the kitchen and pointed at her, he had pulled her from the shadows, and now she was learning how to stand beneath the light. The sound inside the ballroom echoed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the smooth notes of live jazz drifting through the air, and Emily sat quietly beside Nathaniel, trying to steady her breathing as the surrounding attention slowly dispersed, leaving a space that felt almost peaceful, allowing her to blend in for a moment even if only on the surface. Yet another sensation began to creep through her chest, something she could not name, something that raised goosebumps along her spine, even though the room remained warm. She turned her head, almost instinctively, her eyes scanning the crowd with a primal alertness, and then she saw him, not in any dramatic way, no glaring stare, no suspicious movement, just a man standing near the bar at the far end of the hall, positioned far enough to avoid notice but close enough to observe everything, dressed in a suit, a glass of wine in hand, looking like any other guest. But to Emily his face was unmistakable. A faint wave of dizziness passed through her when their eyes met for the briefest moment, and she turned quickly away, her fingers tightening in her palm until they went white. That man did not belong here. He was not a friend of the Callahans, not a chance attendee, but the one who once stood at the foot of the stairwell in the cheap apartment building where she used to live, the one who watched her through a rearview mirror for weeks before she moved into the Callahan estate, the shadow in her nightmares that jolted her awake in the night with cold sweat down her spine. And now he was here, in the same room, breathing the same air. Emily lowered her head, forcing her panic not to surface, feeling as though something invisible was tightening around her throat, the air thickening, as though everyone in the ballroom could hear the frantic pounding of her heart. Nathaniel turned toward her, a slight crease between his brows. "Are you all right?" Emily pressed her lips together and gave the smallest shake of her head. I need a breath. He stood immediately. The balcony. She did not protest, and they left the hall, walking through a corridor toward the small garden behind the hotel, where soft lighting washed over the stone path and the scent of lavender drifted in the breeze. Emily stood by the railing and drew in several deep breaths, as though she were trying to pull oxygen into a chest that refused to expand. Nathaniel did not question her right away, only stood beside her, hands in his pockets, his gaze directed toward the stillness of the dyed garden. "Tell me," he finally said, not rushing her, not demanding. Emily turned toward him, her eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. "I think I just saw him, the man who used to follow me. I do not know his name, but I recognize his eyes, and he is here, at this wedding." Nathaniel was silent for a few seconds, his gaze shifting from her face toward the shadowed edge behind the wall of flowers. "You are certain?" "Certain," Emily whispered. "I will never forget that face." Nathaniel pulled out his phone and signaled Ethan. "Verify every guest immediately, especially any unfamiliar men near the bar. Check the security cameras." Then he looked back at Emily, and his eyes had changed colder, sharper, and something dangerous had awakened beneath them. "From this moment forward, you do not leave my sight." "Not even a step." Emily nodded, because she had no one else to rely on, her hands still trembling, but in Nathaniel's eyes she saw something that kept her from collapsing, not a promise of safety, but a silent vow that if anyone came near her again, they would face a storm. When they returned to the ballroom, Emily was still shaking, but she no longer felt alone, because the man who had followed her might be hidden in the shadows. But the one walking beside her was the light no one dared challenge, and tonight, whatever game had begun, it was no longer the same. As soon as they stepped back into the ballroom, Nathaniel caught a warning look from Ethan standing near the side entrance, and he did not speak, only gave a discreet nod before moving closer to Emily, resting a light hand against her back, a gesture that appeared polite to onlookers, yet carried a clear signal between them. Emily felt the change in his stride. He no longer walked with measured ease, each step now deliberate and carrying a quiet urgency. His breathing steady, but his gaze sweeping the room like a man accustomed to living at the edge of danger. "Follow me," he murmured, low enough for her ears alone. And she did not ask why, did not need to know, only understood that if Nathaniel Callahan said they had to leave, she should not argue. They slipped through the crowd, turning toward a side passage that led to the service corridor of the hotel, where Ethan was already waiting, holding open a metal door leading to the back emergency stairwell. And no one saw them leave, or if they did, no one dared stop a man moving like a storm about to break. When the armored SUV door slammed shut behind them, only then did Emily inhale sharply, realizing she had been clenching her hands so tightly that her knuckles were white. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice thin with worry. Nathaniel did not look at her immediately, listening instead to Ethan's rapid report through his earpiece. "The man is not on the guest list. No one knows who he is, and he left the hotel the moment you stepped onto the balcony." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I want his image sent to every team. Monitor all cameras within a 2-mile radius." Then he turned to Emily, who was trying to steady herself, though her hands still trembled. "I could not leave you there. Not under these circumstances." Emily nodded, because she did not want to stay either, the sensation of being hunted, watched, seen by the eyes that had haunted her for months pressing against her chest like a stone. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. "To my home," he answered without hesitation. "From now on, you will be under my direct protection." Emily's eyes widened. "Not the Callahan estate?" "No. Security there is predictable, and if he got into the wedding without anyone detecting him, I cannot take that risk." The car moved through Chicago's night streets, the city lights reflecting across their faces through the darkened glass, and Emily glanced at Nathaniel, who sat silent, yet radiating a tightly controlled tension, and she realized she had never seen him like this before. Nathaniel had always been the embodiment of control, calm, cold, impenetrable, but now she felt him restraining a quiet fury, not because she had done anything wrong, but because someone had dared approach what he intended to protect. "Who do you think he is?" she whispered. Nathaniel stared forward. "I am not certain, but he is not merely trying to frighten you. He has a purpose, and I need to know who he is working for." When the vehicle turned onto a private road lined with tall trees, Emily saw a different kind of residence, nothing like the estate where she worked, no opulence, no glittering displays, only a modern, fortified home, secured by its own independent system and bearing no name on any sign. Nathaniel led her inside, and the door locked behind them with a solid sound like a declaration that from this moment no one would enter without permission. Emily stood within the spacious interior of glass walls and dark wood, everything exuding simplicity and strength, like the man himself. "The bedrooms are upstairs," Nathaniel said, direct and without embellishment. "But tonight you will stay in the room closest to mine. There will be someone guarding your door at all hours. And I will be right next to you." Emily nodded, offering no objection. She no longer had the strength to protest, nor the foolishness to refuse the only shield that allowed her lungs to draw breath again. She followed him upstairs, each step feeling like she was crossing further away from the world she once knew. In the quiet moment after the door closed, she looked at Nathaniel, and in his eyes she no longer saw the cold ruler of an empire, but a man trying to protect something he never expected to need to protect. And she understood this night did not merely mark the shattering of false safety, but the beginning of something more dangerous, more real, and perhaps without any way back. The small room beside Nathaniel's was wrapped in soft light and the warm scent of wood, so quiet that Emily could hear her own heart racing after the unbearable hours that had led her there. And she sat on the leather chair by the window with her hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on the dark yard beyond the line of trees, knowing this place was safe, knowing the security system was activated at its highest level, knowing someone stood guard just outside her door. Yet the thing that eased her the most was something simpler. Nathaniel was here, not in a distant estate surrounded by layers of people, but just beyond one wall, close enough that if she grew afraid, he would hear it. The door opened softly and Nathaniel entered, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone, holding 2 cups of hot tea he had taken from the kitchen below, and without courtesy or formality he handed one to her, the warmth of the porcelain seeping into her palms and making her feel close to tears, though she did not cry, for she had never allowed herself that luxury. Nathaniel sat in the chair across from her, his hand still around his cup, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me about it," he said, not forcing her but giving her no escape, and Emily lowered her head, fingers tightening around the handle of the cup until, after a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely loud enough to exist in the stillness of the room. "I once thought I could start over. When I came to Chicago, I changed my name, my address, avoided every connection. But I was wrong. Nothing truly disappears if you have not confronted it." She looked up and met Nathaniel's gaze, and for the first time she did not look away. "I am a witness in a federal investigation. My former lover was part of a major money laundering network. I did not know until it was too late. When I discovered the truth, I went to the police. I testified, and I thought that would be enough." Nathaniel remained still, his expression unchanged, no shock, no judgment, only quiet listening, and Emily drew a breath and continued. "After the trial, they told me I needed to enter witness protection, but after a few weeks I escaped. They began treating me like a burden, and no one cared whether I lived or died. I was afraid. I lost all faith in any system. I chose to hide, to survive on my own, to make myself small enough not to be seen." She looked down at her hands. "But he still found me. I think he works for Hayes, the man who ran the network. Hayes disappeared after the trial. No one knows where he went. But I know he never let me go." Nathaniel set his cup on the table. "And no one from the authorities helped you after that?" "No one," Emily whispered. "I have been alone." A silence fell between them, not a distance but the quiet of a man thinking quickly and deeply about what must come next. And Nathaniel rose and stepped closer, kneeling before her, his gaze softer now, his voice low but unwavering. "From now on, you will not be alone." Emily's eyes widened, her lips tightening as if to hold back something rising in her throat. "You do not know how dangerous I am to be near, Nathaniel. What I carry should not touch your life." "Emily," he said, speaking her name without formality or distance, "I am a man with enough enemies to last a lifetime. I know what danger is, but I also know what it means not to abandon someone who needs me." She looked into his eyes and saw a truth she could not deny, because Nathaniel Callahan did not say things he did not intend to keep, and she nodded, very slightly, but for him it was enough. He took her hand, not tightly, only enough for her to feel the presence of someone she no longer had to walk beside the world without. And in that small room where the darkness outside still waited, something fragile yet real began to kindle, not a hurried love, but a promise that required no words at all. Moments after that promise left his lips, a sharp, urgent knock cut through the room. Ethan entered without waiting for permission, his face stripped of the calm he usually wore. Nathaniel rose instantly, and Emily instinctively withdrew into herself, as though her body sensed something was about to shift the air around them. Ethan handed Nathaniel a phone, his voice low but tense as tightened wire. "Boss, you need to see this. It was just sent to the secure line." Nathaniel took it, and the moment the screen lit, his expression darkened. Emily could not see the message, but she saw the change in his face, and it drained the warmth from her blood. He handed the phone back to Ethan without a word, then turned to her. "He knows," Nathaniel said, no pretense, no softening. "Hayes sent a message." The floor beneath Emily seemed to ripple like water. She slowly set the teacup down before her stiffening fingers could drop it. What did he say?" Nathaniel looked directly at her, his voice so low it barely carried breath. "He wants a meeting. And he called you by name." Emily inhaled sharply, her breath catching halfway. Not her, not the witness, not that girl who disappeared. He said her name, Emily Carter. It meant he had never stopped tracking her, that he always knew she was alive, that he still intended to finish what he considered unfinished. Ethan placed the phone on the table and read the message aloud, each word falling like a blade. "We both know she did not tell the whole truth. I want to meet to ensure her silence still holds value. One conversation, private, no police. If you refuse, I will collect what is mine." Emily closed her eyes, breath trapped in her chest. "Collect," she whispered. Nathaniel understood before she spoke another word, his tone turning sharp as steel. "He is referring to you." Ethan folded his arms, glancing at Nathaniel. "He wants the meeting tonight. At a closed club by the river. He wants you alone, and clearly he assumes you will agree." "And he is wrong," Nathaniel replied without hesitation. Emily shook her head, her voice breaking. "Nathaniel, you cannot meet him. Hayes is not like the others. He does not threaten to frighten people. He threatens as a warning before he moves." Nathaniel stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder, steadying her as though he feared she might fall. "You think I would let him get near you again?" She lifted her gaze to him, searching for assurance stronger than his words. "But if you go, he will use me to pressure you. If you refuse, he will use you to terrify me. There is no safe choice." Nathaniel leaned down slightly, his voice slower, lower, solid. "There is one choice. I go, but not under his terms. I will learn what he has, what he wants, who he is holding leverage over, and I will end this before he gets close to you." Ethan looked between them, then nodded slowly. "We prepare. Backup cars, exit routes, long-range coverage, shadow teams. No one moves where he can detect them." Emily listened, feeling like she was watching a storm take shape right in the center of the room, and she reached for Nathaniel's sleeve, the first time she had ever reached for him willingly, her voice trembling almost beyond sound. "Promise me, you will come back?" Nathaniel did not answer at once. He touched her cheek, making her lift her eyes to his. "I am not the kind of man who walks away and leaves someone else trembling in the dark. A beat, a breath. I will come back." Emily felt her chest tighten, not because she believed it completely, but because she understood this was not a gentle vow. This was a declaration of war. Ethan stepped back toward the door, but before he closed it, he added quietly, "If Hayes is asking for a meeting, he is desperate. And a man like him only gets desperate when he knows he is losing control." Nathaniel gave Emily's hand one final, grounding squeeze, then rose. "From this point on, you do not leave this room. A guard will be outside. If anyone other than me opens that door, you do not answer." Emily nodded, but her eyes followed him as though afraid that if she blinked, he would vanish. Nathaniel stepped out, the door shutting behind him, and silence returned to the room. But this time, the silence was not a refuge. It was a countdown. Outside these walls, the world was shifting towards something from which there would be no return. And one question hung in the thickened air. If Nathaniel Callahan walked into that meeting to protect her, Would he return with clean hands, or become the man he had sworn he would never become? The Stygian nightclub sat deep within an unnamed alley along the western riverfront of Chicago, a place untouched by the city's lights, where public security cameras mysteriously stopped working, and where only the biggest names were spoken of through silence. When the car stopped at the side entrance of the old building, now reinforced with black glass and cold steel, Nathaniel Callahan stepped out without looking back. Ethan did not follow. No one did. That was the condition. But it did not mean he came alone. From the top floor of the building across the street, 2 snipers were already locked on target. In the back alley, 3 of Nathaniel's men disguised as utility workers were prepared to intervene within 10 seconds, and inside the sleeve of his black coat, a compact Sig Sauer sat loaded and ready from the moment he left the house. Inside the nightclub, pale violet light washed over raw concrete walls, and a low, resonant hum vibrated from the speakers installed beneath the floor. But tonight there was no music, no patrons, no dancers. Only a long table set in the center of the empty dance floor, and a man sitting at its far end, as though waiting for a dinner at which he himself was the main course. Hayes, tall, lean, his graying hair combed back with unnecessary precision, dressed in a charcoal suit and a deep red tie. He looked more like a character lifted from a Mafia novel than the man who had once made the federal government spend years cornering him. Nathaniel walked forward without haste, resting a hand on the back of the chair across from Hayes but not yet sitting, and the 2 men stared at each other in a silence that held no civility, no pretense, only the ruthless assessment of 2 people who understood the rules of the underworld better than anyone. "Nathaniel Callahan," Hayes said first, his voice soft as cigarette smoke yet edged with something sharp, like broken glass dipped in honey. "I must admit, you surprised me. I thought I'd have to send a few more reminders before you paid attention." "You have my attention," Nathaniel replied, his gaze steady. "But that's not something I recommend anyone seek." Hayes smirked. "Then let me be direct. I want her. I don't care what she testified, or what she knows. I want to erase her from this world for one simple reason. She made me lose control, and I do not forgive that." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, his voice even, and cold as ice. "It seems you still don't understand. Emily Carter is no longer prey. She stands inside my circle, and no one survives crossing into it without an invitation." Hayes let out a small laugh, soft, but carrying a quiet madness. "Your circle once had many inside it, Nathaniel. Some of them don't have names anymore. I don't think you're any different." "I am not like anyone," Nathaniel answered, finally sitting down with deliberate calm, placing both hands on the table as if positioning his pieces in a game. "And I don't play hide and seek. I play to end things." Hayes tapped a finger on the table. "You will lose more than you think if you keep her. Power, loyalty, fear. Those 3 things have kept the Callahan name intact. But my people are beginning to ask questions. Those who used to be loyal to you are whispering. They do not like seeing their king slipping over a housemaid." Nathaniel leaned back and crossed his arms, his eyes gliding over Hayes as if he had anticipated every word. "And you think you can use someone else's loyalty to threaten me?" Hayes leaned forward. "No. I'm simply reminding you that every empire collapses when the man at the top lets emotion interfere." Nathaniel let out a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "You're wrong. Empires collapse when the man at the top sits across from someone like you and still believes he's worth negotiating with." The air thickened instantly. Hayes stopped smiling. Nathaniel rose, turning away without hesitation, and before leaving the table, he spoke in a low, clear tone. "The conversation is over. If you touch her even once the next time we meet, there will be no table, only blood." He walked away, the steel door closing behind him with the finality of a period slammed onto a page, and inside the empty nightclub, Hayes remained seated, the faint smile creeping back onto his lips, but this time stripped of confidence, replaced by something quieter, unease. Because in Nathaniel Callahan's eyes as he walked away, Hayes had seen something he had never witnessed in the underworld, a man who had chosen to stand for someone not for strategy, not for gain, but for conviction. And to men like Hayes, that was more dangerous than anything else. The morning after the meeting at the nightclub, Nathaniel Callahan returned at nearly 3 a.m, at an hour when the city felt so silent it was as if every living thing were holding its breath. Emily had stayed awake, never leaving the room as he had instructed, but every passing minute had felt like a thorn driving deeper into her chest. She stood close to the door, listening for any sound in the hallway, as though a single unfamiliar noise might shatter the fragile sense of safety she had only just begun to touch. When she finally heard the front door open, her heart slammed wildly against her ribs. No voices followed, no sound of Ethan's footsteps, no low conversation. Only Nathaniel's steady, heavy stride, heavier than usual as he crossed the hallway. She wanted to run to him, to ask what had happened, to touch him, and be sure he was still himself whole, unharmed. But when her hand reached for the doorknob, his footsteps stopped just outside, then resumed, neither slowing nor quickening, as though he knew she stood on the other side but chose not to stop. The next morning, Emily came downstairs later than usual. She assumed that after everything, Nathaniel would want to speak to her, but he wasn't in the living room, he wasn't in the kitchen, and when she asked Ethan, he replied with only a brief, clipped answer. Nathaniel was meeting with the security team. For the next 3 days, Nathaniel seemed to vanish from her world. He no longer brought her along for security checks, no longer shared quiet dinners with her in his office. Every time she saw him, it was through a half-open door, a momentary glimpse on a security monitor, or the distant sound of his footsteps in the hallway. He still protected her more fiercely than before. He doubled her personal security, replaced every coded system, installed 6 additional surveillance cameras around the property. But his presence, the thing that had made Emily feel safe, had pulled back into a distance she could not bridge. She didn't blame him. She understood. After the encounter with Hayes, everything had shifted. She was no longer just the housemaid accidentally swept into his world. She was a name spoken by his enemy, a vulnerability he could neither expose nor ignore. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the wooden deck, Emily saw Nathaniel standing alone near the lilac hedge. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled high, his gaze fixed on the forest behind the house. She approached slowly, stopping a few steps behind him. "Are you hiding from me?" she asked, her voice soft but clear enough for him to hear. Nathaniel didn't turn right away. Only after a long breath, one that sounded as though it had been trapped inside him for days, did he speak. "I'm protecting you. By disappearing?" she asked, the tightness in her chest pressing upward. He turned then, and for the first time in days their eyes met. By staying sharp. Emily said nothing. In his gaze, she could see a quiet war logic battling something he refused to name. "I know I've made everything complicated," she said. "I didn't come here to destroy your world." "You didn't destroy it," Nathaniel said, stepping closer. "You made it real. And that makes it dangerous." He paused, his voice lower. "I lived my whole life by one rule. Never let anyone become a weakness. Don't love, don't trust, don't let anyone in. But you made me forget that rule." Emily's fingers curled, tears pushing up behind her eyes. "And now you're trying to remember it," Nathaniel nodded, barely. "Because if I don't, I'll destroy both of us." She didn't know whether to step into him or away to hold him or hold herself. But in that moment they both understood. This was not an ending. It was a retreat. A necessary distance to keep the thing growing between them from being swallowed by a world where every emotion carried a price. And from the upper balcony, Ethan stood silently watching. He said nothing, but his eyes revealed one truth. For the first time in years, the Callahan kingpin was not merely protecting a woman. He was fighting to hold on to the last piece of humanity the underworld had stolen from him long ago. That night, the wind from Lake Michigan slipped through the slightly opened windows, carrying a coldness that seeped gradually into the layers of air inside the mansion. Emily could not sleep. She tossed and turned in the unfamiliar bed with sheets that felt too clean, pillows that felt too quiet, the silence almost unnatural. After days of living with the vague ache of a nameless distance between her and Nathaniel, she no longer knew what she was allowed to hope for. She remembered his eyes as he stood beneath the porch the day before, the words he spoke cutting clean lines through her heart, honest, piercing, and impossibly far away. Emily stepped out of her room, not turning on the lights, her footsteps soft as breath as she walked along the dark wooden hallway, as though every wall were holding its breath to listen. She had not meant to go far, only wanted a breath of cold air to ease the turmoil in her chest. But when she reached the staircase leading down to the first floor, she froze. Below, Ethan's voice rose, low and steady, mingling with the faint click of a lighter. "You have never been like this, Nate. Not even when you were betrayed. Not even when you lost family. But this time, you are changing." A silence followed long enough that Emily thought they might have discovered her. Then Nathaniel's voice emerged, rougher, deeper, sounding like a man who had swallowed an anger he had not yet released. "I know. And that is exactly what scares me." Ethan did not respond immediately. Emily could almost picture his calm, perceptive gaze, the way he always observed everything before drawing conclusions. Nathaniel spoke again, and this time his voice sounded like a confession with no church to hold it. "I lived my entire life the way I was taught: control, distance, decisions made without considering emotional consequence. But from the moment Emily walked into that kitchen, I have not been in control of anything." I looked at her, and in that one moment, I knew if I did not do something, I would lose the one thing that makes me feel like I am not completely dead inside. Emily held her breath, her heartbeat pounding so loudly she feared Ethan might hear it. "You love her," Ethan said, not as a question, but as a statement. Nathaniel did not deny it. A heavy breath slipped out. Then he spoke, slow, as if each word were being drawn from the deepest part of him. "I do not know if it is love. I only know that when she smiles, I want to keep that smile forever. When she is afraid, I want to be the last person she ever has to run to. When she is near, I feel myself soften. And when she is far, the world feels emptier than I ever imagined it could." Ethan exhaled, the lighter clicking again. "That is love, Nate. And you are allowed to feel it, no matter the rotten world we live in." "I am not afraid of love," Nathaniel replied. "I am afraid of losing her. I am afraid that one day men like Hayes will not aim at me, but will force me to choose between the world I built and a woman who has nothing but a heart strong enough to make me forget myself." Emily turned away, her hand gripping the wooden railing, tears spilling before she could stop them, not from pain, but from the shock of hearing words she never believed she would hear. From a man like Nathaniel. In the darkness below, Ethan let out a quiet breath of a laugh. "Maybe for the first time in your life, you are the most human version of yourself." "And maybe for the first time," Nathaniel answered. "I am not sure that will save anyone." Emily slipped back toward her room, moving as though even a single heavy step might shatter the fragile moment hanging in the air. But when the door closed behind her, she no longer felt alone. Because now she understood. His silence was not distance. It was the struggle of a man trying to keep her safe without tearing apart the world he lived in. And that, harsh as it might be, was the clearest proof that his heart had long since stopped belonging solely to himself. The next morning, when Emily woke after a night of almost no sleep, the safe house was wrapped in a strange atmosphere. The everyday sounds, the footsteps of guards, the quiet exchanges over radios, even the soft classical music usually drifting from the hidden speakers gone without a trace, replaced by a heavy, taut silence. When she stepped out of her room, the 2 guards stationed at her door immediately turned, their eyes sharp with alertness, and one of them spoke softly without looking away from the hallway. "Miss Carter, please return to your room. Mr. Callahan has ordered that you do not leave the protected area." And when she asked what was happening, her heart pounding at the sense of something wrong, they offered no reply, only tightened their grips on their earpieces, nodded at someone through the comms, and gently steered her back inside. A moment later, Ethan appeared, the familiar half-smile gone, his face drawn tight as wire and his steps hard and quick. And when Emily asked what was happening, worry thick in her voice, he did not answer until he had entered the room, closed the door with care, checked the signal jammer in the corner, and only then turned to her, saying, "We have a mole." Emily felt the air around her turn cold, asking how he knew, and Ethan replied that their Tier 3 security system had been disabled the night before for exactly 1 minute and 15 seconds, during which a segment of camera footage had been copied, something no outside hacker could do, meaning only someone with physical clearance was responsible. A group limited to 3 people inside this house. Emily's hands tightened as she asked who, and Ethan told her they didn't know yet. But Nathaniel was tearing through every personnel record, every relationship, every history, every detail. She sank into the nearest chair, her thoughts spinning, because if Hayes had a man inside the house, then he knew everything. Where she slept, who guarded her, every weakness. Ethan nodded, saying that this was why she could not leave the sight of him or Nathaniel for even a second, because this was no longer defense, it was loss prevention. Emily felt her stomach twist and asked if he thought the mole was someone near her, and after a brief hesitation, Ethan answered that if the mole had overheard even a single conversation between her and Nathaniel, then he would not be aiming only at her but at the weak spot shared between them both. Emily understood, because in this world a weak spot was not the place you could not defend, it was the place you could not afford to lose. At that moment the door swung open and Nathaniel stepped in, dressed in full black, a gun at his hip, his face set like stone. But when his eyes found Emily, they softened for the briefest second. "Are you all right?" he asked. And she answered quietly that she was, though they both knew she was not. And he turned to Ethan, ordering him to erase the past 3 months of data from the old servers, restore only the private offline backups, and shift all internal communication to triple-layer encryption. "What about the outside teams?" Ethan asked, and Nathaniel replied that only his own men would remain, and anyone who had ever worked for a third-party contractor was to be fired immediately without explanation. Then he stepped closer to Emily, saying, "I will not let anyone near you, not even those who once stood beside me." Emily looked at him without speaking, a single truth looping through her mind. If there was a traitor inside the perimeter, then nowhere was safe. And the worst part was the question that rose unbidden: who was it? The guard who greeted her each morning at the shift change? The technician who maintained the server room? The operative who had driven the backup car that first day? Or someone she had thought of as a friend? But whoever it was, she knew only one thing now. The rules of the game had changed. And she, who once wanted nothing more than to remain unseen, was now standing in the center of a battlefield with no way back. The decision was made only minutes after Nathaniel received the latest report from the new security team. No more suggestions, no half measures, only an order delivered in a low, gravel-edged voice and a look that allowed no argument. Emily would no longer stay in the small second-floor room she had once believed to be the safest place she had known since stepping into the Callahan estate. She would stay in Nathaniel's own room, inside the fortified lower level behind a triple-locked coded door that only the two of them could open. Ethan escorted her downstairs, saying little except for a single clipped sentence. He does not trust anyone anymore, not even the people who swore their loyalty. When the door opened, Emily stopped short. She had been in Nathaniel's room a few times before, but always briefly bringing files, carrying a tray, waiting for instructions, and this space looked nothing like the guest quarters above. No showiness, no expensive artwork, no chandeliers or hand-embroidered silk, only cold gray walls, dark wooden floors, bookshelves built into both sides, and a large bed covered with a white duvet smooth enough to seem untouched, everything orderly and hushed, like the man who owned it. Emily stood at the threshold, uncertain what role she occupied now: prisoner, protected guest, or something suspended uneasily between the two. Nathaniel stood by the window, not turning as he spoke in an even tone that sounded like he was reading a protocol brief. "From now on, you stay here. You do not leave unless I or Ethan are with you. All outside communication is suspended: phones, internet, even the news channels. If you hear anything unusual during the night, press the red button beside the bed. The door will lock automatically and the system will alert the entire estate." She swallowed and asked quietly, And you?" He turned then, his gaze resting on her face for one heartbeat longer than necessary. "I will be here always within your sight." It was not reassurance. It was a command, a truth, the only thing he could do to ensure she would still be alive in his world when everything reached its end. Emily stepped inside slowly, as though each step peeled away the last remnants of the disguise she had worn for years. She sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clasped together as if trying to anchor herself in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. Nathaniel faced her, the lamplight catching the sharp planes of his face, revealing lines of exhaustion she had never seen so clearly. And when she whispered, "Do you think the traitor will strike again?" he did not answer immediately, only came closer, resting one hand on the frame of the bed as he nodded once. If he risked exposing a fragment of information, it means he is hiding something far larger. And Hayes is not the kind of man who sends threats and waits. Emily bit her lip, accustomed to living in shadows, accustomed to running, yet being locked in a room with the one man she trusted and feared losing made her chest constrict. "Are you sure keeping me beside you won't make everything worse?" she asked. And Nathaniel met her eyes, his gaze sharp as a blade, though his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I tried keeping you at a distance, It only made me lose control. And with what is coming, I cannot afford to lose anything again. She wanted to ask what he meant by again who had once stood where she stood now, who had vanished into the darkness of the world he lived in, but she did not ask, because his eyes already answered with fear, regret, and the fragile trust he was placing in her like a final gamble. Night fell quickly, as though the darkness itself understood this room had become the center of everything. Emily lay on the bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, while Nathaniel sat at the desk without turning on the computer, quietly studying security maps instead. Between them stretched a mere few meters, and also an invisible wall he had built to keep her safe, but both of them knew that no matter the distance, their hearts were no longer separate. And in that sealed room, there were not just two people trying to stay alive, there was something else growing quietly between them, something fierce and undeniable, the very thing that had started all of this. The next morning began with an unusual stillness, so complete that Emily felt as though the entire mansion had been frozen inside a moment without time. Nathaniel was no longer in the room when she woke, yet his long coat still hung loosely over the back of a chair, and a half-finished cup of coffee sat on the table, proof that he had left only minutes earlier. She rose, pulled a light robe across her shoulders, and moved toward the door, but before her fingers touched the handle, it swung open from the outside and Ethan appeared, his expression more severe than she had ever seen it, saying, "You need to come with me now. Something has happened." And without waiting for questions, he turned swiftly, forcing her to almost run to keep pace. They moved through the lower hallway, into the private elevator that carried them up to the surveillance room, where the atmosphere hung thick with tension. A large screen filled with cascading data, encrypted signals, and in the center a single message glowing in a cold monochrome font. I know what she saw. Emily tightened her grip on the edge of her robe as her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Nathaniel stood before the screen with his back straight, his gaze locked on the brief sentence, his hands clenched at his sides until his knuckles turned white. She needed no explanation. She knew it was Hayes, and he had just confirmed the fear everyone carried. He knew. Ethan stepped forward, entered a series of security commands, then faced Nathaniel, saying, "The message was sent through the old internal network. Someone used a device inside this facility to route it through. No encryption. He wanted us to see it." Nathaniel said nothing, only tilted his head slightly, his eyes shifting toward Emily, and in that brief glance she saw something she had never seen in him before, not anger, not fear, but a deep self-reproach, as though he were burying the weight of his own failure inside his chest. "What did you see, Emily?" he asked in a low, steady voice that sounded less like an interrogation and more like a confession he needed to hear spoken aloud. Emily stepped back, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I am not completely certain, but I think it was back in New York, before I left. One night I was cleaning on the 10th floor of a hotel they used for private meetings. I wandered into a conference room that had been left open. No one was there, but on the big screen, there were videos, maps, and a name." She faltered, her voice breaking. "I did not understand everything, but there was a transaction, involving someone inside the government." Ethan drew a sharp breath and looked at Nathaniel. "If that is true, then Hayes is not afraid she will talk to the feds. He is afraid that what she saw could drag down an entire chain of people." Nathaniel turned back to the screen where the message sat like a coiled serpent waiting to strike. "We have a mole." He knew exactly when to send the message when Emily was out of my sight, when there were only 3 people in the control room. This is no longer a threat. It is a declaration of war. Emily trembled, not from fear for herself, but from the dawning realization that the cost of entering this world was not just a new life. It was accepting that she carried a memory capable of making the powerful tremble. Nathaniel stepped toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder, saying, "From now on you do not leave my sight. No one except Ethan comes near you. All outside communication is shut down. I will trace the origin of the message, and when I find the one who allowed this to happen, there will not be a second chance." She nodded, unable to speak, because in that moment Nathaniel no longer looked like the cold man who once pulled her out of a kitchen. He looked like the last fortress standing between her and a world where truth could be buried beneath blood. But deeper than the threat from Hayes, she saw something more frightening in Nathaniel's eyes, the fear of losing her not because of what she knew, but because of who she had become to him. And that was why, when they stepped out of the surveillance room, his hand remained wrapped around hers, as though if he let go for even a heartbeat, everything would collapse in an instant. The entire house shifted into an entirely different state after Hayes's message appeared. No more laughter, no more familiar rhythms of the guards moving through their routines. Every exit, every electronic device dismantled, every member of the security team isolated and questioned one by one. And through it all, Emily never left Nathaniel's sight, not even half a step. Whenever he met with Ethan or checked the surveillance systems, she was there, quiet, steady, moving behind him like a shadow, loyal to the only man she believed could keep her alive through the storm closing in. Yet within Emily's silence, Nathaniel understood that every passing minute was another minute she was being pulled deeper into danger, and that could not continue. He stood in the lower-level map room the next morning, before a large table covered with blueprints, satellite images, detailed records of Hayes's financial dealings over the past 12 months, and fragments of the recovered data from the footage Emily had stumbled upon years earlier, the very data someone had tried to erase from the hotel's internal system in New York. Ethan stood beside him, arms crossed, worry etched across his face, while Nathaniel pointed to a map pinned against a glass board, saying, "He is hiding in a warehouse complex in the Southern Industrial District, registered under a shell company in Toronto, but backed by an investment fund tied to an Eastern European syndicate. Tomorrow night, we go there." Ethan frowned, asking if it was too risky, reminding him that if the government was involved, they could not handle this alone. "I do not need the government, I need an ending," Nathaniel replied, his gaze sharp as a blade. "I will not let him keep sending messages like that, and I will not let Emily live with a shadow of fear behind her." He turned to the screen displaying the list of suspected personnel. Of the 15 people with close access to the security system, only 2 had suspicious financial activity within the past 3 months. One of them was Alex Rourke, a tech specialist brought in last year through a partner recommendation. Ethan nodded, saying he would handle Rourke, but Nathaniel cut him off. "No, I will speak to him myself. If someone sold me out, I want to look him in the eyes when I ask why." Then he glanced upward toward the corner camera, as though he knew Emily was watching him through the private surveillance feed in her room. "Ethan, when I leave, you stay. She does not leave your sight no matter what happens." Ethan hesitated, asking if Nathaniel intended to go without telling her, and Nathaniel answered, "She will want to come with me, but I cannot let her take a single step further into that darkness." He leaned over the table, his hand resting on a file containing photographs of Hayes through the years, each one tied to European trails, underground deals, and suspected witness eliminations. "He has survived because people feared him into silence," Nathaniel said quietly. "But Emily is no longer afraid, and if she has the courage to face her own memories, then I do not have the right to hide from mine." The room seemed to hold its breath as Nathaniel lifted the desk phone and issued calm orders. "Prepare the car. I want 3 men, only 3, no more than 15 minutes inside the target zone. No engagement unless provoked. If it comes to that, end it quickly." Ethan watched him, then finally nodded, saying, "Are you sure, Nate? This is no longer just a personal mission." Nathaniel let out a faint, almost humorless smile, his eyes like tempered steel. "No, Ethan. For the first time in my life, I am doing something not for power or reputation, but for a woman. And if the whole world decides to come for me because of that, then let them." When he walked out of the room, the tall silhouette he cast was no longer that of a cold, untouchable kingpin. It was the figure of a man who had chosen to end the nightmare not only to protect Emily, but to free himself from the chains of a past that had held him captive for far too long. A man preparing to face the name whispered with dread across the underworld: Hayes. A light rain was falling over Chicago as the armored SUV turned onto the dirt road leading into the abandoned warehouse compound on the city's southern edge. No streetlights, no traffic, only a dense curtain of night and the crunch of tires grinding over gravel. Inside the vehicle, Nathaniel remained silent, his gaze fixed on the darkness ahead, the shoulders of his black shirt damp with rain, the gun resting quietly across his thigh, while the 2 men accompanying him, Lars and Dom, former operatives who had once worked with a tactical response unit in Europe, understood that tonight was not a mission, it was a confrontation, the ending of something that had dragged on far too long. The warehouse gate stood open as if someone had been waiting. No guards, no gunfire, only a single overhead light casting a harsh circle across the cold emptiness of the warehouse floor, and a wooden table with 2 chairs, one of which Hayes occupied, calm, cold, with that familiar crooked smile resting on his lips, as though everything had always been in his control. Nathaniel approached without introduction. Hayes already knew. Hayes had always known, while Lars and Dom positioned themselves 10 steps behind, weapons hidden beneath their coats, but ready to be drawn in an instant. "I am not here to talk," Nathaniel said as he pulled out the empty chair and sat, his eyes locked on the man across from him. "I am here to end this." And Hayes let out a soft laugh, telling him he was always dramatic, admitting he was impressed by the girl Emily. Wasn't it? And remarking that he never expected a housemaid to make Nathaniel throw away the system he had built for more than a decade. Nathaniel replied that he had thrown nothing away, he had merely changed his priorities, and Hayes, lifting an eyebrow, countered that no shift in priorities could stop him, because the girl had seen something she should never have seen, something capable of bringing down very powerful people, and he could not allow that, even if he had to silence her himself. Nathaniel then took a small device from inside his coat, set it on the table, and a thin blue beam flickered to life, projecting a recording into the air. The hotel conference room from 2 years earlier. The night Emily had wandered into the wrong place, the footage crisp, unedited, undeniable, showing Hayes with 3 high-ranking political and financial figures, signing an agreement whose partially visible contents were enough to imprison every man at that table for the rest of his natural life. Hayes stiffened. Nathaniel leaned in, his voice no longer cold but honed like steel, saying, "Emily didn't just see it. She remembered the date, and that was enough for me to recover the deleted file. And that moment was now," explaining that an encrypted copy of the footage had been sent to 3 separate locations, and that if he did not return within 2 hours, everything would be released. Hayes clenched his jaw, eyes shifting as though searching for an escape, but Nathaniel gave him none, telling him this was no longer a choice. Either he disappeared, or everything he had ever built would be torn apart in full view of the world, and Nathaniel swore he would be standing there to watch it fall. The warehouse air thickened, no wind, no gunfire, only 2 men facing each other across a table weighted with years of power, fury, and memory. Finally Hayes rose, offering no words, only a small nod, an acknowledgement that the game was over not because he lacked pieces, but because the man across from him had left him no path to run. Nathaniel stood, retrieved the device, and stepped back. No shots were fired, no chase ensued, yet when the warehouse doors closed behind him, everyone understood that the balance of power had shifted, and in that cold, rain-washed night, a man walked out of the darkness not merely as a survivor of the underworld, but as someone who had finally chosen the one thing worth keeping, the life of a woman and the fragile, fierce trust he had never believed he deserved. Returning to the safe house at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, Nathaniel stepped out of the car into a mist of soft rain and the dim security lights reflecting off the concrete hallway, where Ethan already stood waiting, asking no questions, only giving a brief nod as though he had known the outcome long before. There were no alarms, no pursuit, no blood. Yet for Nathaniel this was the first time a war had ended without leaving a wound on his skin, only fine fractures spreading quietly inside his chest. He did not go straight to his own room but walked instead through the reinforced corridor, his leather shoes echoing steadily like an unspoken promise, and when he touched the door handle, the bedroom door eased open without a lock. Emily was sitting at the edge of the bed, still wearing her pale sweater, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She looked up, her eyes widening the moment he entered, and she did not ask, did not demand explanation, only rose and stepped toward him as though those few feet were the last barrier keeping them in 2 different worlds. "Are you hurt?" she whispered, her hand grazing his sleeve as if to be certain he was whole, and Nathaniel watched her for a long moment before giving a slow nod. "It's over. He will not return." Emily drew in a long breath, as though for the first time she could finally fill her lungs after days spent living inside fear. But what stunned her was not the reassurance, it was the way Nathaniel came forward, placing his hand against her cheek with a gentleness she had never seen in him. "Emily," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "do you know that through all of this, the thing that kept me from breaking was not power, not strategy, but your eyes?" She shook her head, tears rising at the corners. "I am only someone who once tried to make herself invisible. That is exactly what makes you more present than anyone I have ever known," he answered, his hand sliding lightly through her hair. "You never sought attention, never demanded anything, never used anything but silence to defend yourself, and that is what made me want to stand on your side at any cost." Emily bit her lip, lifting her gaze to him. "But I have a past. I witnessed things I never wanted to remember. I am not sure I am someone you should need." Nathaniel gave a faint, weary smile, the kind that belonged to a man who had lived too long among cold handshakes and quiet betrayals. "I do not need someone without a past. I need someone who knows how to rise from it. You have no idea how strong you are, Emily. And I think it is time I tell you the truth." He stepped back, standing tall, his eyes fixed on hers without blinking. "I have lived nearly 40 years in a world where no one cared for me, only for the name I carried. But you are the first person who ever made me believe that maybe I deserve something more than that." She said nothing, only stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, her face pressed to his chest, where his heartbeat thudded slow and steady, like a solemn melody after a long and violent storm. And Nathaniel held her tightly, whispering against her ear, "You are no longer part of my plan, Emily. You are the destination. You are where I choose to stop." Tears fell onto his shirt, and she did not hide them. She let herself melt into that moment, letting her heart beat not out of fear, but out of the belief that, after everything, she had been chosen not by accident, but because someone had finally seen her. Not the uniformed girl, not the witness to an unforgiving secret, but the real woman, with all her fragments and unfinished edges. And that man was Nathaniel Callahan. Morning had already begun to soften the sky when they sat together in the warm living room, the first light of day slipping through the curtains and brushing gently across faces, still marked by exhaustion yet filled with a quiet peace. Nathaniel poured Emily a cup of hot tea, his hand resting lightly atop hers, as though every breath he took from this moment forward required her presence beside him. The alarms were gone, the fear of being watched from the shadows had lifted, and there remained only two people, two souls who had walked through harsh and heavy days to finally find each other. Emily looked up at him, still not quite used to this gentleness from a man who had once been the embodiment of power and control. "What will you do now?" she asked softly, her voice uncertain, as though afraid his answer might drag them back into the complicated world they had barely escaped. Nathaniel smiled, unhurried, and rose, crossing to a drawer from which he retrieved a small wooden box, simple, elegant, and placed it into her hands, speaking slowly, each word weighed with his whole heart. "Inside is not a ring, Emily. It is a key. The key to a house on Lake Michigan that I bought last year, when I first began to imagine another kind of life, not to run, but to live. If you want it, we can begin there. No gunfire, no counterattacks, no secrets between us. Just two people, one home, and quiet mornings like this." Emily opened the box, looked inside, then looked up at him, her eyes trembling not with doubt but with the unfamiliar realization that, for the first time in her life, someone was giving her the right to choose not to survive by running, not to hide from whatever might happen if she were found, but to truly live. "Do you really think I can have a normal life?" she whispered. And Nathaniel moved toward her, sitting across from her with no trace of the pride he once wore as armor, only the sincerity of a man opening himself completely. "No, Emily, I do not think it will be normal. But I know it will be real. And for the first time, I do not want to promise you with words, I want you to see it. Now I show you what forever looks like." The words hovered in the air like a quiet melody, simple, yet striking the deepest place inside her. Emily did not answer at once. She simply smiled, slow and full of emotion. And in that instant they both understood that the future did not need to be flawless, it only needed to be true. The story of Nathaniel and Emily was not just a journey through danger, nor merely a connection between two people from impossibly distant worlds. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures, a sincere look, a word free of calculation, or a hand that refuses to let go when everything else is falling apart, hold the greatest power to save a fragile soul. It was a lesson in choosing between power and love, between control and surrender, between the past and the future. And you, listening to this story, what about you? In your own life, has someone ever made you want to choose again, to begin again? Have you ever felt that you belonged nowhere, until someone stepped forward and told you that you deserved to be seen? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every story carries a piece of someone who is listening, and we would be honored to hear yours from the deepest place in your heart. If this story touched you, do not forget to subscribe, like, and share the video so that more people can hear stories filled with humanity and quiet healing each day. Every share you make helps spread warmth and comfort to those who may need it more than ever. Thank you for staying until the end of Nathaniel and Emily's journey. We look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we will continue exploring moving stories, glimpses of ordinary lives filled with unseen miracles. Wishing you and your loved ones good health, joyful days, and a life filled with peace and light. Goodbye, and see you in the next one.